Okay, good morning, everyone. It's 11 a.m. and we can start our panel. I welcome everyone who is joining us today. We will be talking about a very important topic. As many of you know, February 24th marks the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, the invasion that led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people, including civilians, large-scale destruction, and numerous atrocities committed by the Russian forces. This invasion, in a way, is a continuation of the policies set by the Kremlin in 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine and stirred up the tensions in the Donbas region. But this invasion 2 years ago marked a dramatic escalation of hostilities. And one of the biggest questions right now is, given the scale of all these war crimes, how will Ukraine and the international community pursue accountability for perpetrators and justice for the victims? So today we have three exceptional guests on our panel, and I'm excited to introduce them. First, we have Oleksandra Matviichuk, a Ukrainian lawyer and human rights activist. Her Center for Civil Liberties, established in 2007, won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2022. Oleksandra spent many years using her work to promote democracy in Ukraine, and now her organization is focused on documenting war crimes. We also have Michael Sharf, an American lawyer in the field of international criminal law. Michael is a co-founder of the Public International Law and Policy Group, an organization which provides legal assistance to parties involved in peace negotiations and war crime prosecution. And we have Pavel Latushka, one of the most prominent Belarusian opposition figures. Mr. Latushka works closely with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who de facto won the presidential election in Belarus in 2020 and is in charge of sanctions. Since 2020, Mr. Latushka has been collecting evidence of various transgressions that took place in Belarus in the last 4 years. And his team is now involved in documenting Lukashenko's involvement in war crimes in Ukraine. So we have a great lineup of guests today who have vast knowledge of the topic, and I'm excited to have you all here today. Now, a little bit about me. My name is Pavel Kutseval. I work for Human Rights Foundation, where I oversee Eastern Europe and former Soviet republics. Human Rights Foundation is a nonprofit organization that focuses primarily on authoritarian regimes. And this panel is part of our effort to keep the topic of the war in Ukraine visible. Also with this panel, we want to shed light on the topic of war crimes, as this subject can be fairly complex. So without further ado, let's get into the questions. I would like to address the first question to Michael. When we talk about the war in Ukraine, there are a lot of terms being kind of thrown around almost interchangeably: war crimes, crimes of aggression, genocide, crimes against humanity. Could you please talk a little bit about the differences between these terms and how they can be potentially misused in a discussion about the war?
Sure, Pavel. So let's begin with war crimes. War crimes are those violations of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their additional protocols of 1977 that have individual criminal responsibility attached to them. And those are crimes against civilians, against POWs, in the way that you conduct a war. And it only applies when there is an ongoing armed conflict. So in 2014, there was an ongoing armed conflict in Crimea, and starting in 2022, there was an ongoing armed conflict in Ukraine proper, and all of the terrible things that are going on in the midst of that conflict can constitute war crimes, and they are prosecutable by national courts in Ukraine because there's a statute that allows the prosecution of war crimes of both Ukrainians and foreign nationals. They're prosecutable in other national courts throughout Europe and throughout the world, and they're also prosecuted by the International Criminal Court, which has jurisdiction. Then the next category is crimes against humanity. That's defined as systematic and widespread attacks against a civilian population. And that can occur during peacetime or during war. A lot of the things that are occurring are both war crimes and crimes against humanity, and you can be convicted of both for the same offenses. Then there's the crime of genocide. That comes out of the Genocide Convention of 1948. That was created after World War II to prevent what happened to the Jews throughout Europe from ever happening again. And it says that when you attack a national group, a religious group, a racial group, or an ethnic group with the intent to destroy that group, and that's been interpreted as in substantial part, if not the whole group, then you've committed what is sometimes known as the crime of all crimes, genocide. It's the worst crime possible. And so there are allegations that what has happened at the hands of Russia in the Donbass region, Mariupol, and other places is not just a crime against humanity. It's not just ethnic cleansing. It's really an attempt to commit genocide. And then finally, you have the crime of aggression. This was one of the crimes that the Nazis were prosecuted for successfully after World War II. The International Criminal Court originally did not have jurisdiction over the crime, and in 2010, they added that jurisdiction to the crime, but they gave it so many obstacles that it can't be prosecuted by the ICC with respect to Ukraine because Russia is not a party to the amendment from 2010. Now, the crime of aggression could be prosecuted by an ad hoc tribunal or a hybrid tribunal, and there are proposals for that. The crime of aggression is basically defined as one country attacking another when it's unjustified. It's not in self-defense, and therefore it is, if genocide is the crime of all crimes, aggression is the crime that all the other crimes stem from. Because if it wasn't for the Russian attacks against Ukraine, all of these war crimes, the crimes against humanity, and the potential genocide wouldn't have occurred. So those are the terms that are being used. And I think that you can follow up later, asking about how they might be misused, but this gives a good structure for the following discussion.
Perfect. Thank you very much. The next question I would like to address to Oleksandra. Could you please talk a little bit about how the evidence of Russia's war crimes is collected? Can you talk a little bit about the process and maybe describe some of the challenges that you're facing?
When the large-scale invasion started, we faced with unprecedented amounts of war crimes. And that is why we united our efforts with dozens of regional organizations. We built a national network of documentators, and we have an ambitious goal to document each criminal episode which was committed in a smaller settlement in each oblast in Ukraine. And we use different sources. We send mobile groups to release territories. We collect testimonies of victims and witnesses of the war crimes. We analyze open data sources with further verification, is it truth or not. And if something happened, we are able to send our local documentators to the place of accident. For example, if Russian rocket hit a residential building, our documentators can be on the spot and make their own photos, videos, and speak with people. So working together for this 2 years of large-scale invasion, we jointly documented more than 64,000 episodes of war crimes. And 64,000, this is an enormous amount, but it's just a tip of iceberg because Russia uses war crimes as the methods of warfare. It's a way how Russia wants to win this war. Russia attempts to break people's resistance and occupy Ukraine by inflicting the enormous suffering of civilian people. So we document not just violations of Geneva and Hague conventions, we document human pain. And probably this is the main challenge because you can't be prepared for such level of atrocities. Even me, with all my experience in human rights field, all my knowledge of international law, all my field expertise, I was unprepared and I'm still unprepared. Sometimes you have such a feeling that this pain is burn you out.
Thank you, Alexandra. And Michael, to get back to you, what are the existing international legal frameworks that can be applied to hold perpetrators accountable for the crimes they committed in Ukraine? And what are the crimes that can be prosecuted?
Right, and I alluded to this before, but so the International Criminal Court is basically the modern day Nuremberg. It has 124 parties, and anytime there is a war crime, a crime against humanity, an act of genocide in the territory of one of those 124 parties, the court has jurisdiction, no matter who committed the crime, even if it's committed by a national from a state that is not a party to the ICC statute. That's what's going on here. So Ukraine has, by declaration, accepted the jurisdiction of the ICC. And it goes all the way back to 2014. The ICC has been investigating. They have 70 prosecutive staffs. These are attorneys that are experts at war crimes that spend all their time investigating the information that groups like Alexandra's have provided to them. And there are just mountains of information coming in. So far, the ICC has issued one indictment, and that is for President Putin and the head of the office that does adoptions. And it's a very interesting indictment because it is about the abduction of Ukrainian children who were then transferred to Russia and then put up for adoption. And this indictment is based on the precedent of the Nuremberg trial, where they successfully prosecuted and convicted Germans for doing the same thing to Polish children, who they abducted in Poland, sent to Germany, and had them adopted and became German citizens. And so the law is clear. The evidence for this is really clear. And the reason they started with this is because it's a case that really pulls at the heartstrings of people. And the documentation shows that there's over 20,000 of these children, and that the order and the plan to do this went all the way up to President Putin himself. And there's all kinds of evidence for this. Now, that's not the only crime the ICC is going to prosecute. They are currently looking at future indictments, and I predict in the next couple of weeks or months, the next indictments are going to be about some of the worst war crimes that we heard about. Later in this conversation, we'll be talking about Mariupol, but a lot of people remember that theater photograph with before, and it says, "Children are here, don't bomb." And afterwards, the Russians specifically targeted and killed all the children. That's the kind of thing that the ICC would find a very easy case to prosecute as a war crime. And it fits into the idea of massive bombings and attacks against civilians without discriminating between civilians and military targets. And that's really what's been going on in this war. So the ICC is one place these are being prosecuted, but the ICC only takes a couple of cases, usually at the highest level. Most of these cases are going to be prosecuted in Ukraine. And I have heard that there are 90,000 cases that are active case files. There are many, many prosecutors and investigators that are working on these cases. And the big challenge is going to be twofold. One, prioritizing them, because to prosecute 90,000 cases of war crimes would take about 50 years. So they're going to have to prioritize them. And the second is they're going to have defendants in custody. And the ones that are over in Russia, Russia's not going to extradite them to the Ukraine. So these are mostly going to be captured soldiers or people that end up in other countries that are willing to turn them over to the Ukraine. Also, other countries throughout Europe will start prosecuting, and they've been doing this with respect to the Syria conflict under universal jurisdiction. And so you'll see that there'll be some Russian perpetrators that end up in other countries in Europe, and Europe may decide to extradite them to the Ukraine, or they may say, we have the resources and the evidence, we'll prosecute them ourselves. And so those are the places you'll start seeing these cases tried.
Very interesting. Thank you, Michael. I would like to address the next question to Mr. Latushka. Mr. Latushka, you and your team has been involved in collecting information about the role of the Lukashenko regime in the war in Ukraine. Could you please talk about the role Belarus plays in these war crimes, and specifically talk about forceful deportation of Ukrainian children?
Thank you so much, Pavel. Thank you, Human Rights Foundation. When we speak about the role of Belarus in the war crime of unlawful displacement of the Ukrainian children, we speak about the role of Oleksandr Lukashenko and his accomplices. As the findings of the National Crisis Management show, the decision to bring the children, among them orphans and children from the vulnerable groups, to Belarus was explicitly agreed upon by Alexander Lukashenko and Russian President Putin. On the day when the National Crisis Management submitted the first communication to the ICC, Alexander Lukashenko publicly declared his key role in these displacements. He literally said, "I contacted Putin and asked, listen, let's spend a part of the union budget on those kids. That's how they started bringing them in." Later, he also confirmed this publicly. I quote, "We agreed with Putin that we would finance these trips from the union state budget. We did and will do this regardless of any reproaches." The transfers were implemented by Alexei Talai, a Belarusian Paralympic athlete known as a confidant of Alexander Lukashenko, and his Talai Foundation, in cooperation with Olga Volkova, Russian citizen, and her Donetsk-based organization Dolphins, as well as the local Russian occupation authorities. Additionally, Belarus's largest potash fertilizer producer, Belaruskali, and its Director General, Senator Ivan Halavati, have been involved in this displacement, as he ordered to host the children in the Dubrava camp, located in the Minsk region and belonging to Belaruskali company. We documented that since August 2022, several groups of children, including orphans, have periodically been transferred from the Russian-occupied territories of Ukraine to Belarus, with some of the children taken to Russia and appearing in a publicly available Russian adoption database. However, since September 2022, a systematic campaign to bring Ukrainian children to the Belarusian Dubrava camp. In the period between September 2022 and May 2023, about 2,100 children aged 6 to 15 years, including orphans and children from other vulnerable groups from at least 15 Ukrainian towns under Russian occupation, were brought to the Dubrava camp, allegedly for rehabilitation. The children were subjected to pro-regime and anti-Ukrainian re-education aimed at erasing the Ukrainian identity. This included meetings with Russian and Belarusian state representatives, pro-regime's artists, representative of the Russian Orthodox Church, and paramilitary patriotic organization. For instance, in October 2022, a Belarusian duo, the Gruzdeva sisters, expressed their desire that Biden dies, God forgive us, Zelensky dies too, and that Putin prospers and takes control of all of Ukraine.
Mr. Alatushka, given all the violations committed by the Lukashenko regime, both domestically and internationally, in your opinion, what can be done to keep Lukashenko to account? And in your opinion, what would be the best route for Ukraine and the international community to pursue accountability?
I will try to answer. Transfers of the Ukrainian children to Belarus amount to the war crime of unlawful deportation or transfer under Article 8 of the Rome Statute. Alexander Lukashenko is individually, criminally responsible not only for directly committing this crime, but also for his involvement with others under Article 25 of the Rome Statute, and based on superior responsibility under Article 28 of the Rome Statute. To address these serious allegations, the National Anti-Crisis Management submitted an Article 15 communication in June and complementary submission in November 2023 to the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague. It is necessary to conduct further documentation of these crimes using all available practices. This is what the National Anti-Crisis Management does. Having certain capabilities and expertise in Belarus, we are trying to complement the work of international mechanism and law enforcement in Ukraine. We believe it is important to simultaneously actively advocate for the accountability of those responsible for these war crimes, primarily Oleksandr Lukashenko, to give greater relevance to these crimes in the eyes of the international community and the International Criminal Court.
Thank you so much. Oleksandra, I would like to address the next question to you. Can you please tell us about the role of the Ukrainian courts and the work they do right now in the effort to prosecute war criminals?
The problem is that for current moment, the Office of General Prosecutor officially registered more than 120,000 criminal proceedings. And I totally agree with previous speaker that to investigate in accordance to all international requirements, more than 120,000 criminal cases during the war, it's impossible even for the best national system in the world. Ukraine is not the best national system in the world. And that is why we need international assistance. And when large-scale invasion started, I saw several directions of such assistance. First, international partners organized different trainings for investigators, prosecutors, judges. And this is essential, but it's not solved the problem, because if each Ukrainian investigator has to parallel investigate more than 2,000, according our information, 2,000 cases, they have no time for trainings. As well as second direction of assistance, that international partners spending resources to hire high qualified international advisors. And yes, for sure, we need consultations, but like if you have a car without petrol, you can hire the best driver in the world. But if you have no petrol, the car will not move. So we need to solve this practical problem. We are lacking working hand on the grounds, and trainings and consultancy will not make us more efficient.
And Mr. Latushka, to get back to you, you and your team have been involved in collecting evidence and promoting the idea of a tribunal for Lukashenko and his actions in 2020, which, according to some, amount to crimes against humanity. With your experience of working both on the events of 2020 in Belarus and now the war in Ukraine, in your opinion, what are the biggest problems that you see in the current international mechanisms, and in what ways can they be improved?
First of all, what I want to mention is that Lukashenko realized more than 136 crimes against humanity. It is a huge scale of repressions in my country, in Belarus. It is very difficult, very dramatic situation till today. So we are focusing for the question of accountability also we are focusing on the crimes against humanity committed by Lukashenko against Belarusian people. I must start with the fact that these two contexts are very different in nature, in the attention of the international community and in the capabilities that Ukraine has in comparison with Belarusian democratic civil society. Therefore, the vector of problems that need to be solved is very different. although there are certainly common things. I cannot access the capabilities of our Ukrainian colleagues, but I regret to state that our civil society was not ready to confront the scale and nature of the crimes that have been occurring in Belarus since May 2020. We were faced from the outset with a lack of personnel who could adequately lead the accountability strategy for core international crimes in the Belarusian context. Belarusian civil society was not represented in the coalition for an international criminal court, one of the key platforms for civil society to promote ideas of accountability before the ICC. The sphere of international criminal law turned out to be simply an undeveloped area of law in Belarus. We had to learn everything on the fly. We attracted Belarusian experts who worked abroad as well as our foreign colleagues in order to build our strategy for achieving justice and implement it properly. So, to achieve justice in Belarus, we were forced to start from the basics. We needed appropriate personnel and the creation of organizations that could solve these challenges. We need investments in this sphere. Secondly, to work in the new context, the ICC needs an appropriate budget and the formation of a sufficient number of personnel staff. Finally, I would like to know that we must honestly say that international criminal justice has problems relating to the politicization of specific processes. In order to begin an investigation into the Belarusian situation, it is necessary to use mechanism, Article 14 of the Rome Statute, for example, which in practice largely depend on political conditions rather than the interests of justice. It is reality.
Thank you so much. And Alexandra, to get back to you, how does Ukraine cooperate with international institutions and courts in relation to war crimes since the February invasion? And would you say the cooperation has been fruitful, and can it be improved in the future?
I can describe very briefly this cooperation. Starting with our initiative Tribunal for Putin, we provide information from our database to International Criminal Court, to International Commission on Inquiry, which was created by UN Human Rights Council, to OSCE Moscow mechanisms, to national legal enforcement bodies, so to any international structures who officially provide investigations or have to provide to made as official assessment about situation in Ukraine. And I know that Office of General Prosecutor very closely cooperate with the field Office of International Criminal Court on the ground, and there is a common tradition for them to prosecutor from ICC and General Prosecutor of Ukraine to appear in a press conferences and or some public event and to describe the situation which they can to describe, keeping in mind that there is a secrecy of investigation. But the problem is that we have no international courts who can prosecute Putin, Lukashenko, and top political leadership and high military command for the crime of aggression. Last year, the International Center in The Hague was established, which composed from prosecutors from 5 countries, and this can be a first step to establish such a special tribunal. And it's highly needed to establish it because all these atrocities which we now documented, it's results of the leadership decision of Putin, Lukashenko, and their surrounding to start this war. And it's a common logic. If we want to prevent wars in future, we have to punish the state and their leaders who start such a war in present. And that is why I use this opportunity to once again emphasize that there is no reason to wait when and how this war will end. Well, we have to start this special tribunal now and hold this people who responsible for the crime of aggression accountable.
Thank you so much. Michael, there was a report recently that came out on Mariupol, a city of just under 500,000 people that was essentially destroyed by Russia. The report outlined the war crimes committed by the Russian troops, including attacks on civilians and blocking of humanitarian aid. We know that tens of thousands of people have been killed in the city, yet it's unlikely that Russia will cooperate or give out the perpetrators, not at least until Putin is in power. Could you please tell us, how can Ukraine and the international community address war crimes when they're committed on such a large scale, when the perpetrators are not willing to cooperate at all, and when the location of atrocities itself is still occupied by the perpetrator?
So this Human Rights Watch report that you're referring to is quite extraordinary, and I suggest anybody should read it. You might want to share the link, because not only does it quantify the number of people and buildings that were damaged and killed, but it also is very qualitative. It includes videos and photographs, and it tells stories. And those kinds of reports are very helpful, because when you just hear mass numbers, I think people's eyes gloss over. But when you remember about the human factor in all of this, and Mariupol was just a horrible catastrophe in the scale of human lives lost and buildings. And it showed the blueprint that Russia has for attacking a city and trying to create its utter destruction, and really not allowing civilians to escape the harm, but focusing on killing them as well. Now, what's also extraordinary about this report is that it goes into a lot of detail about who in the Russian command structure is responsible for this. And it says that this was the whole tactics, the strategy here, it came from Putin himself. So it came all the way at the highest level. And it mentions that there was the Russian command, and you have the defense minister and the general staff, and then down to the district army commanders. Now, you're absolutely right, Pavel, that most of these people are not going to fall into the hands of Ukraine. They're going to be over there in Russia, and they may never, in the short run, come to justice. Does that mean they shouldn't be indicted by the International Criminal Court or by the Ukrainian courts? Absolutely not. There is tremendous value in taking the first step in accountability, which is an indictment and an arrest warrant. For Putin, it makes him literally a prisoner in his own country. So just like al-Bashir from the Sudan, who can no longer travel around the world because he's been indicted for genocide with respect to the Sudanese war, Putin can only travel now to a couple places safely. He can go to North Korea, he can go to Iran, maybe Cuba, but he can't go to South Africa for a world conference. And he's told, don't show up or we're going to arrest you. Can't go throughout Europe. He can't go to the United Nations. It's really hard to run a country when you're a prisoner in your own country and you can't travel. Secondly, when anybody ever talks about Putin, he now has a new moniker: indicted international war criminal Vladimir Putin. And that's going to slowly erode support from him at home as well as abroad. And we've seen other leaders who everybody thought would never fall from power, never see justice. People like Slobodan Milosevic of Serbia and Charles Taylor of Liberia. They get indicted by international courts, and slowly their power base erodes, and ultimately they faced international justice. It took a while. Meanwhile, the sanctions that have been imposed by many countries are starting to have an effect on Russia, and the military assistance for the Ukraine is so important right now. And by having an international indictment, and I would say also by strengthening the indictment with following subsequent indictments, I'd love to see one focusing on Mariupol. I think that is the classic example of horrible war crimes that the Putin and his commanders ought to be prosecuted for. And when you get an indictment and you show the evidence in a court of law, and they have this thing called the confirmation procedures, which are like a mini court that can do a trial of presenting and confirming the evidence, even without the defendant present. When you do all that, that will remind the world what the stakes are, and that will help create the political will to expand sanctions and to continue the foreign assistance, the military assistance to Ukraine. So I think the answer to your question, Pavel, is yeah, it might be the case that these people aren't going to be prosecuted anytime soon. But the beginning of the prosecution process, the indictment, the arrest warrant, is absolutely essential.
Thank you so much. And to follow up on this, Michael, what are the avenues that currently exist for victims in Ukraine to receive some sort of compensation for their suffering and losses?
Okay.
Are there any?
Yeah, there are. One of the most important developments in international law that have come out of this conflict has been that the Security Council of the UN has been paralyzed by Russia's veto. And the UN General Assembly has resorted to a mechanism called the Uniting for Peace mechanism, which it hadn't used in 40 years. And that mechanism says when the Security Council is paralyzed by a 2/3 vote, the General Assembly can take action, which otherwise the General Assembly and the UN could not take. And one of those resolutions, and there's a series of resolutions they've passed. One of them excludes Russia from the Human Rights Council. One declares that the invasion was an act of aggression. One says that the plebiscites in the Donbass region are illegitimate and the annexation is illegal. But a really important one, Pavel, for the question you asked, established an international registry. And what the registry does is it is documenting the damage to buildings, to farms, to the environment, and the injuries to human beings, civilians. And ultimately, that is going to be the base by which people are going to get compensated for the war crimes and the damage. Now, where is the money going to come from? I think most of the listeners here know that Russia's assets have been frozen by a number of countries throughout Europe and the United States and the West. The amount of frozen assets now is over $300 billion. And just the interest on that is $16 billion. There are proposals first to use the interest to immediately start compensating the victims. But there are also proposals to use the corpus of the $300 billion. That's about half of Russia's foreign assets. It's a huge amount of money. In fact, the estimates by the World Bank are that it will take $410 billion to completely help resurrect Ukraine. And this would go a long way toward that, the $300 billion. The problem is something called foreign sovereign immunity. And so there are legal scholars that are right now focusing on whether a legal argument can be made, given that Russia has committed these crimes pursuant to a war of aggression, that would mean that there would not be foreign sovereign immunity as a legal obstacle to using these assets. I predict that this money is going to be used, and it is going to go a long way to helping the victims of this war.
Thank you so much, Michael. The last question for today, Oleksandra, in your opinion, what support services, psychological, financial, or social, should be available to victims of the conflict in Ukraine, and what support services are currently available to the victims?
It's a very difficult question to answer because millions of Ukrainians are suffering. If I speak about, for example, psychological help, millions of people feel pain and need some assistance. And I'm, for example, became an ambassador of all Ukrainian psychological program, which is focused on prevention, because we understand that we can't provide million psychologists to each people in need. And that is why now we try to elaborate some programs how to prevent the worst conditions and how to educate people to help to provide them instrument to help themselves if we speak about psychological assistance. This question is very depends on the type of crimes. When we speak about survivors of sexual violence, because it's a very hidden crime and not a lot of people applied for assistance and for provide their testimonies. And also taking into account that there is a huge international attention to this topic, and we have a very great international organizations who cooperate with state bodies and civil society organizations. We see some positive changes, but for example, in September 2022, even a special department in Office of General Prosecutor was established to work with survivors from sexual violence. But people who suffered from other crimes and needs material and psychological supports, the conditions is not so good because of once again, of the enormous amount of such people. And the main question, which I think it has to be touched, how to stop these war crimes to commit, because while we are discussing, people are illegally detained, people can be in this concrete moment tortured to death, and the amount of number of people who need assistance is increasing from day to day. And that is why, for me, it's very understandable that we have to stop Russian war crimes, which means that we have to stop Russia in Ukraine. And because even if we are not be able to do it, it will be the all-day process, and every day we will face with hundreds and hundreds of fires, which we have to deal with.
Okay, thank you so much. This is it on my end. Those were all the questions that I had. I thank all the participants today who shared their knowledge and their opinions, and I thank everyone who joined us today to watch this panel. I think the conversation on war crimes is rather heavy and difficult, but nonetheless, it's important to have such conversations, and HRF is committed to supporting Ukraine and its civil society. So again, thank you all so much, and take care.